Yeah, welcome to Chapter 2 of The Great Gatsby. I am sitting in an appointment now, and we're going to talk Chapter 2. So if you could get your packet out and your book out, I'd appreciate it. This chapter doesn't have a ton of things happening in it, but we get some important settings that show up throughout the rest of the book. So, for instance, on page 23, and you don't need to write this one down, about halfway between West Egg and New York, the motor road hastily joins the railroad and runs beside it for a quarter of a mile so as to shrink away from a certain desolate area of land. This is the Valley of Ashes, a fantastic farm where ashes grow like wheat into ridges and hills and grotesque gardens, where ashes take the forms of houses and chimneys and rising smoke, and finally, with the transcendent effort of men who move dimly and already crumbling through the powdery air. Now, this is kind of like an industrial waste area, right? And so we have Manhattan, where a lot of the industry is located, where people make all their money. We have East and West Egg, where they live. And then this is in the middle, right? And it's dirty, it's kind of gross, and but it's an important setting in the book. Okay, right over that, on page 23, there's a billboard, and we don't know what this billboard means yet. If you watch the new version of the Gatsby, the Leonardo movie, you know, it does some things well and some things not as well. One of the things that makes it good for teaching, but maybe not as good as a book, the book is, it tells you what these things mean, and it tells you the first time it shows up. But we don't know what that means yet. So on the bottom of 23, but above the gray land and spasms of bleak dust which drift endlessly over it, you perceive, after a moment, the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg. The eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg are blue and gigantic, their retinas 1 yard high. They look out over no face, but instead from a pair of enormous yellow spectacles which pass over a non-existent nose. Evidently some wild wag of an oculist, some eye doctor, set them there to fatten his practice in the borough of Queens, and then sank down himself into eternal blindness or forgot them and moved away. But his eyes, dimmed a little by many paintless days under the sun and rain, brood on over the solemn dumping ground. Now, this is where Nick stopped, and he first met Tom's mistress. So if you remember back in Chapter 1, when Nick's over at Tom and Daisy's house and they're having tea with Jordan, Tom gets a phone call, and Jordan seems to indicate that this is Tom's woman that he's having an affair with. She lives with her husband at a garage which is located in the Valley of Ashes across from the big billboard. Okay. Now, once they show up, I want you to write down for the dreams section, if you look up on the top of page 25, because we talked American Dream a little bit the other day, and Wilson is trying to do it the honest way, right? He's working very hard every day, and this is how well it's going. The interior was unprosperous and bare. The only car visible was a dust-covered wreck of a Ford that was crouched in a dim corner. It had occurred to me that the shadow of this garage must be a blind, and that sumptuous and romantic apartments were concealed overhead when the proprietor himself appeared in the door of an office, wiping his hands on a piece of waste. He was a blond, spiritless, anemic, and faintly handsome. When he saw us, a damp gleam of hope sprang into his light blue eyes. So, what I want you to write down is the first two sentences in that, first sentence of that, where the interior was unprosperous and bare, and then end in a dim corner. So if the sub wants to push pause for a minute while you write that down, put that under the dream section, because this is an example of a character trying to do the American dream the right way. He's working as hard as he can. It's not being very successful at it. And if you remember, in comparison to Gatsby, who had a nearly unlimited capacity for hope, Wilson has a damp gleam of hope in his eyes, so less so. Now, Tom comes in and starts to kind of push Wilson around. He says, "Hey, Wilson, old man, how's business?" "Can't complain," answered Wilson unconvincingly. "When are you going to sell me that car?" "Next week. Got my man working on it now." "Works pretty slow, don't he?" "No, he doesn't," said Tom coldly. "And if you feel that way about it, maybe I'd sell it somewhere else after all." "I didn't mean that, So, Tom has come in to take this man's wife away from him, and Tom could help him with his business, right? But Tom has no interest in that. It would cost Tom nothing. I mean, in comparison to all the money he has, cost him nothing to be able to get that car and give it to Wilson, and maybe Wilson could fix it up, sell it, turn a profit, and then use that to invest back in his business, and then maybe things would be going better. But Tom doesn't care about that. Myrtle Wilson comes downstairs, and she says, walking through her husband as if he were a ghost, shook hands with Tom, looking him flush in the eye. "Get some chairs, why don't you, so someone can sit down." So she goes, sends her husband to get chairs, and Tom says, "Meet me on the next train, we're going into New York." Now, Wilson doesn't know his wife's having an affair yet, and Tom doesn't care about that at all. So Tom and Nick get into the cab, and they train, and then they meet up with Myrtle. And on page 27, in the other category, right, we talked carelessness yesterday, this would be a good one. She says, I want to get one of those dogs, she said earnestly. I want to get one for the apartment. They're nice to have, a dog. Now, what she wants is Tom has rented an apartment for their affair, right, and where they would go together. And she wants to make it seem as much like a home as possible. Now, I don't know how many of you have dogs, but a dog is not a purchase that you make without really thinking through what you're doing, right? Dogs are a lot of work. They take a lot of effort. You got to take them for walks, and you got to take them out, and you got to feed them, and you got to take them to the vet, and blah, 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 blah. She doesn't think about that at all, okay? Now, going forward, go to page 29. Now, this is one of those long descriptions. There's a lot of descriptions in the book, and sometimes students complain that the descriptions don't seem to really mean anything or have any import, but this is kind of important stuff. So on the top of 29, the apartment was on the top floor, a small living room, a small dining room, a small bedroom, and a bath. The living room was crowded to the doors with a set of tapestried furniture entirely too large for it, so that to move about was to stumble continually over scenes of ladies swinging in the gardens of Versailles. Now, what she did is she designed the apartment the way she thought wealthy people decorated their where they lived, their apartments, right? She bought fancy furniture, but the problem was it was too big. It barely fit, so you could hardly even walk around. And she bought these huge tapestried paintings, and she tried to make it look like a fancy rich person lived there. But it's a set, right? It's like she's pretending she's playing a role. And that role gets even more so when we go to page 30, and it said, Mrs. Wolfson had changed her costume some time before and was now attired in an elaborate afternoon dress of cream-colored chiffon, which gave a continual rustle as she swept about the room. Swept about the room, not slept about the room. That would be a very different book. Anyway, with the influence of her dress, her personality had also undergone a change. The intense vitality that had been so remarkable in the garage was converted to an impressive hauteur. Her laughter, her gestures, her assertions became more violently affected moment by moment as she expanded. The room grew smaller around her until she seemed to be revolving on a noisy, creaky pivot through the smoky air. My dear, she told her sister in a high, mincing shout. Most of these fellows will cheat you every time. So, I think the important word is there she put on a costume, right? She put on a rich person costume. And then as soon as she starts to talk like, put on her rich person costume in her rich person apartment, the set, right, like an actor would use, she starts to say things that she would not accept. For instance, on page 32, she says, I told that boy about the ice. Myrtle raised her eyebrows in despair at the shiftlessness of the lower orders. These people, you have to keep after them all the time. Now, she's talking about people who don't have much money, right, who are working for her. And ironically, she's really talking about herself and her husband, right? Those people are people like her that don't have very much money. Okay? Now, Nick starts to talk to Catherine, who's Myrtle's sister. And Catherine on the bottom of 33 says, you see, it's really his wife that's keeping them apart. She's a Catholic, and they don't believe in divorce. Daisy was not a Catholic, and I was a little shocked at the elaborateness of the lie. Then, on page 34, Myrtle tells the story when she married Wilson, right? And she said, why'd you do it, Myrtle? Demanded Catherine. Nobody forced you to. Myrtle considered. I married him because I thought he was a gentleman, she said finally. I thought he knew something about breeding, but he wasn't fit to lick my shoe. You were crazy about him for a while, said Catherine. Crazy about him, cried Myrtle incredulously. Who said I was crazy about him? I was never more crazy about him than I was that man over there. The only crazy I was when I married him. I knew right away I made a mistake. He borrowed somebody's best suit to get married in and never even told me about it. And the man came after it one day when he was out. She looked around to see who was listening. Oh, is that your suit? I said. This is the first I ever heard about it. But I gave it to him, and then I lay down and cried to beat the band all afternoon. She really ought to get away from him. They've been living over that garage for 11 years, and Tom's the first sweetie she's ever had. Wilson's had this business for 11 years. You might want to write that quote down in the American Dream part. She's been with him for 11 years. So, after 11 years of hard work living in that garage, they're still there, right? He's working hard every day. Every day he believes that maybe today's going to be the day Tom sells me that car, right? And I can turn things around. Maybe today's going to be the day, somebody comes in and I can make some more money and then invest that back in. And maybe today's going to be the day things turn around. Okay? Now, Nick, back at the party on page 35, is both intrigued and, he's interested, and he's also disgusted by what's going on. These people are getting wasted. And Nick had talked about he had only been drunk once in his life. And so they started drinking in the middle of the afternoon, and they've been drinking whiskey all day. And so by the time they get to the middle of the night, he's been drinking for a good 12 hours. It said, I wanted to get out and walk eastward toward the park through the soft twilight, but each time I tried to go, I became entangled in some wild, strident argument which pulled me back, as if with ropes, into my chair. Yet high over the city, our line of yellow windows must have contributed their share of human secrecy to the casual watcher in the darkening streets, and I was him too, looking up and wondering. I was within and without, simultaneously enchanted and repelled by the inexhaustible variety in life. So he tries to leave because he wants to get out. He's been drinking. He's not happy where he is. But every time he does, something crazy happens, and it's like he keeps getting pulled back in. He doesn't necessarily want to. Okay, now we go on on page 36. And we talked about Myrtle, with her costume on, right? And we get another good quote on page 36 of her costume, and she's acting the way a rich person does in her mind. My dear, I'm going to give you this dress as soon as I'm through with it. I've got to get another one tomorrow, and I'm going to make a list of all the things I've got to get. A massage, and a wave, a Carl for the dog, and one of those cute little ashtrays where you touch a spring, and a wreath with a black silk bow from Mother's grave that'll last all summer. I've got to write down a list so I won't forget all the things I got to do. And all the things she's got to do is spend Tom's money, right? Now, on the bottom of 36, we talked carelessness a little bit earlier, and you might want to jot this down in that others category as well, if the sub wants to push pause after I talk through this. The very bottom of page 36 and the top of 37, this is the last we see of the puppy. Remember they bought that puppy on the street, and they brought it, and it's got a dog biscuit, which has been slowly decaying in a bowl of milk all afternoon. And this is the last we see, the last description on the bottom of 36. The little dog was sitting on the table, looking with blind eyes through the smoke, and from time to time groaning faintly. We don't hear from the puppy ever again. Now, wealthy people acting carelessly, that's the definition of it, right? I mean, if you bought a puppy that you didn't really think through at all, and you didn't feed it, and you didn't take care of it, and then you left it alone in the apartment, there's no one else who goes back to the apartment in the book. Poor puppy. Now, as that's going on, things are getting increasingly chaotic as people are getting increasingly drunk. And it said, people disappeared, reappeared, made plans to go somewhere and then lost each other, searched for each other, found each other a few feet away. Sometime toward midnight, Tom Buchanan and Mrs. Wilson stood face to face, discussing in impassioned voices whether Mrs. Wilson, Myrtle, had any right to mention Daisy's name. Daisy, 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 shouted Mrs. Wilson. I'll say it whenever I want to. Daisy, Making a short, deft movement, Tom Buchanan broke her nose with his open hand. People are freaking out, and people are screaming, and she's crying, and people are yelling at Tom. And then they decide to leave. Now, on page 38, this is a weird bit, okay? If you look on page 38, we have ... And then he's standing beside his bed. I was standing beside Mr. McKee's bed, and he was sitting up between the sheets, clad in his underwear with a great portfolio in his hands. Now, several things. As none of you are 21, none of you know this, and so I'm going to fill you in on something. Sometimes, when one has too much to drink, too much alcohol to drink, one's memories become rather hazy of the day before. And I think that's kind of what's going on here with Nick. So as he left the party, they were in the elevator, then ... he was in Mr. McKee's room, and I'm not sure what to make of that. You know, I always have students suggesting that maybe something would happen between Nick and Mr. McKee. I feel like maybe, but to be able to prove that or to make that a valid thing to talk about, you'd need some evidence for it, and that seems to me that would be, if Nick was having a relationship with Mr. McKee, that would be a pretty big plot point. So I'm not sure what to make of that. Mr. McKee's showing him the pictures he's taken. And then after that, ... then I was lying half asleep in the cold lower level of the Pennsylvania station, staring at the Morning Tribune and waiting for the 4 o'clock train. So then he's nearly passed out in the train station. That's what happens when he hangs out with Tom and Myrtle. One last little question for you. Riddle me this. Does anyone know what the word myrtle means? It's a name, right? And it rhymes with turtle. But why don't you Google on your phone what myrtle means? Because myrtle is in relation to Daisy. So anyway, I will leave you with that. So you're going to read chapter 3 for tomorrow. In chapter 3, and we're going to watch a couple scenes from the Redford version of the movie tomorrow. Chapter 3, we get to see a capital P party, right? Gatsby, once or twice a month, and nobody knows why, throws the biggest party you could ever imagine, right? He hires a full orchestra for music all night. He has 2 fully catered dinners with, steak and lobster, one at 7 and one at midnight. He's got as much booze as people want to drink, and keep in mind that this is during Prohibition. and he doesn't invite anybody. Anybody can just go. And he's got his Rolls Royce running back and forth as kind of a shuttle for people. And people just come when he has these parties. A couple other weird things. He doesn't attend his parties. He just throws them. So we don't know why that is, right? But once we, one of the things the old version does well in terms of the movie, it looks good, right? It shows you the way the 20s looked, and costumes and set and stuff look really good. It's just the acting is really bad. So tomorrow in class, we'll just watch a couple scenes from that to give you a little bit of a sense of kind of what that party looked like and just how big it was, because he is spending a ton of money. So just imagine if someone in your neighborhood randomly, without any explanation or invitation, threw just the biggest party, fully catered, full fancy white linen tablecloth, blah, 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 all that stuff. Would you go? I think I'd be tempted to go. So anyway, be good for the sub. Make sure you keep taking your notes, and I'll see you tomorrow.